It was rush hour, and I was stuck in heavy traffic on my way to the airport. With only 35 minutes left before my flight departed, I knew I wasn't going to make it. Maybe the airline would help me catch the next one if I could get there on time, but I wasn't holding my breath. Sure enough, I missed it. The next flight wasn't until noon the next day. I tried booking a hotel online, but every place was full. Frustrated, I decided to find one myself. As I stepped outside the airport, I saw the same taxi driver who had dropped me off earlier. He was standing there, smiling, like he'd been expecting me. "I knew you wouldn't make that flight," he said, still grinning. I chuckled, appreciating the gesture. "You know anywhere nearby where I can crash for the night?" The driver nodded. "Yeah, there's a place. Not fancy, but clean. Feels like home." I figured one night in a cheap motel wasn't the end of the world. Plus, the guy had waited for me, so I figured I'd throw him some business. I agreed, and he took me there. The motel was small and outdated. The receptionist, a woman in her late 50s or early 60s, greeted me. Lucky for me, there was one last room available. If I had come in a few minutes later, I might have been out of luck. "No room service," she said. "You'll have to handle everything yourself." That was fine. I just needed a bed. But as I unpacked, the room felt off. The dim lighting flickered, and I had the strange sensation I wasn't alone. Shaking off the feeling, I decided to shower before bed. As I let the hot water relax me, I heard the bathroom door creak open. My heart pounded. I shut off the water, wrapped a towel around myself, and stepped out, but the room was empty. The balcony door was cracked open, and outside, the wind rustled the leaves. "Just my imagination," I muttered, brushing it off. I went back to the shower, but the second I turned the water on, it scalded my skin, like someone had cranked the heat up to boiling. I yelped and shut it off immediately. Dressed and still shaken, I stepped onto the balcony to smoke. Below, I saw the receptionist talking to the taxi driver. He glanced up at me but didn't smile this time. He just watched. Something about it unsettled me, but I forced myself to ignore it and went back inside. That's when things got worse. As I sat down on the toilet, I froze. The sound of rushing water filled my ears, but it wasn't the pipes. When I looked into the toilet bowl, my breath caught in my throat. A woman's face stared up at me. Wide open eyes. A smile that sent chills down my spine. I screamed and slammed the lid down, stumbling backward. The room spun, and before I knew it, I blacked out. When I woke up, I was still in my room, but something had changed. My hands trembled as I grabbed a towel to wipe my sweat. That's when I saw it. Long strands of black hair tangled in the fabric, as if someone had placed them there on purpose. I bolted out of the room and ran to the front desk. The receptionist came back with me, but when we entered, everything was normal. My bag was on the desk. The bathroom was clean. No sign of the hair. "You're just tired," she said with an eerie calmness. "Travel can do that to you." But as she left, I saw her whispering to the taxi driver again. He glanced at me with that same expression, cold and knowing. Back in my room, I locked the door and sat on the bed, trying to calm myself. But then, the light switch in the corner of the room began flicking on and off. I turned my head slowly. In the corner, the receptionist sat hunched over, her fingers playing with the switch. Only, she looked different now. Her skin had turned gray, covered in strange cuts. Her eyes were vacant. I scrambled for the door, but cold hands grabbed my wrist. Her voice was a whisper, yet it echoed in my head. "The more you try to run from me, the closer I'll get." Darkness swallowed me again. When I woke up, I wasn't in my room anymore. The air was damp and reeked of rot. The walls around me were covered in names, some crossed out with what looked like blood. And then I saw it. One of the names stood out. My father's name. My blood turned to ice. My dad had disappeared a year ago. No one ever found out what happened to him. I wasn't here by accident. The door creaked open. The taxi driver stepped inside, lighting a cigarette. He exhaled slowly, watching me. "You see," he said, "that woman, her name was Evelyn. A man once promised her he'd change, but he didn't. And now anyone who stays here becomes part of her curse." I realized then, everyone involved in her pain had vanished over the years. And now it was my turn. I was never supposed to leave that motel. I used to work the night shift at a historical tour company in Charleston, South Carolina. We ran ghost tours through the old parts of the city, abandoned asylums, colonial graveyards, and of course, the infamous Holloway Prison, which was rumored to be one of the most haunted places in the state. It was an easy enough job. Walk a group of tourists around, tell some spooky stories, and make sure nobody wandered off. I never really believed in ghosts, but the stories were good for business. That was, until one night, something happened that I still can't explain. It was late October, right around Halloween, when the groups were bigger, and people seemed more eager to get scared. I had a full tour that night, about 25 people, all eager to hear about the dark history of Holloway Prison. The place had been shut down in the 1950s, but before that, it housed some of the worst criminals in the country. Executions took place there, and the gallows still stood in the center of the main yard, weathered by time but eerily intact. The tour was going fine. I was halfway through telling the story of Charles Monroe, a prisoner who was hanged for murder but swore he'd come back to haunt the prison forever. That's when we heard it, a loud, irregular banging coming from the roof of the gallows room. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then it happened again. It was rhythmic, heavy, like someone was stomping across the tin roof above us. The group fell silent. Someone muttered about an animal, maybe a raccoon. I wanted to believe that, but the sound was too heavy. It was deliberate. I tried to play it off, making a joke about Monroe still lurking around, but before I could finish, the banging got louder. It was moving. Whatever was up there wasn't just stomping, it was pacing, like it was watching us. A woman near the back gasped and pointed. "Look," she whispered. Everyone turned. There, at the top of the gallows, just barely visible in the dim light, was a shadowy figure. It was tall, thin, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. I felt a chill run down my spine. I've seen a lot of shadows in my time, tricks of the light, overactive imaginations. But this was different. It wasn't moving like a person. It was twitching, jerking, almost like it was glitching in and out of reality. The air turned ice cold. People in the group started murmuring nervously. I knew I had to keep control. "All right, folks, let's keep moving," I said, forcing a grin. But my voice came out shaky. The figure hadn't moved, but the stomping had stopped. Then, in the dead silence, it happened. A voice, low, guttural, and close, whispered, "You shouldn't be here." It wasn't coming from the figure. It was right next to me. I spun around, heart hammering, but there was no one there. Just the group, staring at me in confusion. My breath came in short gasps. I was done. I led the group out of there, skipping the rest of the tour. I didn't care about the bad reviews or losing my job. Something was in that prison, and it did not want us there. I quit the next day. I still live in Charleston, and sometimes I'll pass by Holloway Prison on my way home. I try not to look at it, but every once in a while, I swear I see something, a shadow standing at the top of the gallows, watching, waiting. I don't know what it is, and I don't want to find out. It was late October when I first met Amanda. She had just moved into the apartment across from mine in a rundown complex on the outskirts of Chicago. The place wasn't much: chipped paint, flickering hallway lights, and an old elevator that groaned like it was alive. I had lived there for nearly 3 years, long enough to know that most people kept to themselves. But Amanda was different. She was friendly, always smiling, and had this way of making you feel like you'd known her forever. I first saw her struggling with a couple of heavy boxes, her long, dark hair falling in her face as she tried to wrestle them through the narrow doorway. "Need some help?" I asked. She looked up, her green eyes glinting in the dim hallway light, and smiled. "That'd be great. I didn't realize how much crap I had until I had to carry it all." I chuckled and grabbed the heaviest box, surprised at how much it weighed. "What do you got in here?" "Bricks? Books," she said, rolling her eyes. "I have a thing for horror novels." That caught my attention. "You don't seem like the horror type." Amanda smirked. "What, do I look like I only read romance?" I shrugged. "Maybe thrillers." She laughed, and we spent the next hour moving her things inside. Her apartment was nearly identical to mine, except she had already started decorating with candles, vintage movie posters, and string lights. There was a certain coziness to it that my place definitely lacked. Over the next few weeks, we became close. We'd grab coffee together in the mornings before work, binge horror movies at night, and talk about everything from ghost stories to weird childhood memories. She was the kind of person who made the world feel a little less lonely. Then things started to change. It was little things at first. I'd hear her talking to someone late at night, but every time I asked, she'd say no one had been over. Her door would be slightly open when I knew she had locked it. Once, I found her staring into her bathroom mirror for what felt like hours, her reflection barely moving. "You okay?" I asked, touching her arm. She blinked and turned to me, her smile forced. "Yeah, just lost in thought." But something was off. I could feel it. One night, we were watching The Shining in my apartment when she excused herself to grab something from her place. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. I figured she had gotten distracted, so I walked across the hall to check on her. Her door was open. I stepped inside. "Amanda?" Silence. A cold draft whispered through the apartment, making the candles on her coffee table flicker. Something about the air felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't quite place. I found her in the bedroom, standing in front of the mirror again. But this time, she wasn't just staring, she was whispering. "Amanda?" She didn't move. My gut twisted. I reached out, grabbing her shoulder. The moment I did, she let out a sharp gasp and turned to me, her eyes wide with something like fear. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, stepping back. I don't know. I was just... I looked past her at the mirror. For a second, I could have sworn her reflection was still staring straight ahead, even though she had turned away. My breath hitched. "Are you okay?" I asked again. Amanda swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yeah. Just tired, I guess." But I didn't believe her. Over the next few weeks, things got worse. She stopped answering my texts. When I saw her in the hallway, she barely spoke, her once warm smile replaced with something cold, distant. Then came the noises. Every night, around 3 a.m., I'd hear scratching sounds coming from her apartment. Faint, but constant. Like nails dragging against wood. I tried ignoring it at first, convincing myself it was just a raccoon outside or something. But then came the voices. Low, murmuring, just on the edge of my hearing. One night I had enough. I knocked on her door, but there was no answer. The scratching continued. Something wasn't right. I grabbed my spare key, she had given it to me weeks ago, back when we were still close, and let myself in. The apartment was dark, except for the glow of a single candle flickering on the coffee table. The air smelled strange, like burnt wood and something metallic. "Amanda?" I called. No response. I stepped further inside, and that's when I saw her. She was sitting on the floor, her back to me, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her hands were moving, scratching at the wooden floor in slow, deliberate motions. "Amanda?" My voice came out hoarse. She stopped. Slowly, painfully, she turned her head to look at me. Her eyes, God, her eyes, were completely black. Not just her pupils, but the entire eye. A sharp chill ran down my spine. "Leave!" she whispered. My legs locked up. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. Then, in a blink, she lunged at me. I barely had time to react before she was inches from my face, her breath icy, her skin pale and stretched tight over her bones. "Leave!" I stumbled back, my heart pounding. My body finally obeyed, and I ran. Out the door, down the hall, into my apartment. I locked the door behind me and pressed my back against it, gasping for breath. Silence. For the first time in weeks, I heard nothing from her apartment. No scratching. No whispers. Nothing. The next morning, I went to check on her, but she was gone. Her apartment was completely empty. No furniture, no candles, no books. It was as if she had never lived there at all. The landlord swore no one had rented that unit in years. I moved out a month later. To this day, I don't know what happened to Amanda. I don't know if she was real, or if something else had been wearing her face. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear the scratching. And I wonder if she's trying to find me again. I was fresh out of college when I landed an internship at a small tech startup. It wasn't exactly a dream job, but I was eager to gain experience, and the company was flexible with my hours. The office was in an old building on the outskirts of town, surrounded by a mix of businesses, including a quiet little funeral home that backed up to our lot. Business was slow, and with little else to do, my boss tasked me with configuring our security cameras to conserve disk space. The cameras had been running 24/7, eating up storage, so my job was to tweak the settings to record only when motion was detected. I set up the software, testing it throughout the day. To ensure everything was working properly, I pointed one of the cameras directly at my desk, mostly for convenience, since I was using my own station as a reference point. I watched the test footage, adjusted the sensitivity, and made sure everything functioned as expected. By the end of the day, satisfied with my work, I shut down my computer and headed home. The next morning, I arrived early, curious to check the overnight footage. I wasn't expecting anything interesting, just the usual late departures of employees locking up for the night. At first, that's all I found. A few clips of people leaving, the last one timestamped around 9:30 p.m. After that, silence. I scrolled forward, expecting the system to be idle until morning. Then I saw a video logged at 3:14 a.m. I frowned. No one was supposed to be in the office at that hour. The cleaning crew had come and gone much earlier, and even the night security was scheduled to patrol outside, not inside. I clicked on the file, and the video loaded on my screen. At first, there was nothing unusual. The office was dimly lit by the streetlights outside. Everything looked exactly as I had left it. But then I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. My computer screen was on. That wasn't right. I had shut it down before leaving. And then, right before my eyes, my desk chair moved. It spun, slowly at first, then picked up speed as if someone had pushed it. But the room was empty. I felt a cold sweat break out along my back. I replayed the video, thinking maybe there was some explanation, an air vent, an earthquake, something. But the way the chair moved wasn't natural. It didn't wobble like it had been bumped or pushed by a draft. It rotated with intent, like someone had given it a firm spin. For a few seconds, the chair spun freely before slowing to a stop. The screen of my computer remained on, casting a faint glow in the otherwise dark room. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the motion stopped. The recording ended. I leaned back in my chair, heart pounding. My desk was positioned against a floor-to-ceiling window that faced a small, overgrown garden. That garden, I realized with a growing sense of unease, shared a back wall with the funeral home. I shook off the thought and decided to check the office myself. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe the camera had picked up something I had missed. With hesitant steps, I walked toward my desk. The air felt oddly still, thick with something I couldn't quite name. My chair was exactly where it should be, pushed neatly under my desk. My computer was off, just as I had left it the night before. There was no sign that anything had been disturbed. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I turned to the window, peering out into the garden. The bushes rustled slightly in the breeze. Beyond them, the funeral home sat in eerie silence. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a software glitch had turned my computer on. Maybe the chair had been slightly unbalanced, and a shift in air pressure made it move. Maybe. A shadow flickered outside. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. It was quick, barely there. A trick of the light, I told myself. A car passing by. A stray cat. I forced myself to turn away, but I couldn't focus for the rest of the day. My mind kept replaying the video, the movement of the chair, the glow of the screen. That night, before leaving, I positioned the camera differently. Instead of just my desk, I angled it to capture a wider view of the office, including the window and part of the garden outside. If something, or someone, was coming in, I wanted to know. The next morning, my hands trembled slightly as I opened the security footage. There was another recording. 3:11 a.m. I clicked play. At first, it was the same as before. The dimly lit office. The stillness of the empty space. Then movement. My screen flickered on. The chair remained still this time, but something outside the window caught my eye. A shape, standing in the garden. Just beyond the glass. I leaned in closer, my pulse pounding. The figure was faint, barely visible in the darkness. A silhouette. Human-shaped, but wrong. As I watched, the figure took a step forward, pressing closer to the window. The video ended. I slammed my laptop shut, my breathing ragged. This wasn't a glitch. This wasn't the wind. Someone, or something, had been watching me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a homeless person passing through the area. Maybe it was a security guard, though none were supposed to be there at that hour. I checked the outside cameras. Nothing. No one had entered the property. The only movement detected was in that one recording. That was my last day at the internship. I made up an excuse and quit later that afternoon. I didn't bother explaining. What would I have even said? That a shadow outside the funeral home had scared me off? That my chair spinning in the dark was enough to make me walk away? I didn't care. I just knew I wasn't going back. A few months later, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the history of that funeral home. It had been around for nearly a century. Before that, the land had been a cemetery, which had been relocated in the 1940s due to urban expansion. Not all the graves had been properly accounted for. Some bodies had never been moved. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't want to know. But I still think about it sometimes. When I'm alone at my desk late at night, when the screen flickers on by itself, when my chair shifts ever so slightly as if someone just stood up from it. And I wonder, did I leave it behind? Or did it follow me? The old farmhouse stood at the end of a long dirt road, flanked by an expanse of open fields that stretched toward the distant hills. I had been visiting my uncle, Rick, for a long overdue fishing trip. It had been years since we last spent time together, and he insisted I stay overnight at his place so we could get an early start. His house was simple, with a detached garage where he kept his tools, an old truck, and random storage bins full of forgotten belongings. Rick set me up in the spare room next to the garage. It was small but comfortable enough. The only light came from a small lamp in the corner, and the air smelled faintly of dust and motor oil. I was exhausted from the long drive and quickly drifted into sleep. At some point in the night I woke up. It was still dark, but I could make out the faint outline of the furniture in the room. My eyes adjusted to the dimness, and that's when I noticed it, a figure, standing against the far wall, arms crossed, just watching me. My first thought was that it was Uncle Rick. Maybe he had come to wake me up for the fishing trip. The figure's posture was relaxed, almost casual, like someone waiting for an answer. I groggily rubbed my eyes and sat up. "Yeah, I'm getting up. Let's go," I mumbled, my voice thick with sleep. The figure remained still. No response. No movement. Just standing there. Feeling annoyed at being woken up without so much as a word, I swung my legs over the bed and stood up, walking toward the light switch. As I moved, I passed right by the figure, close enough that I should have felt something. Body heat, air shifting, anything. But there was nothing. I flipped the light on and turned around. The room was empty. My heart thumped against my ribs. I scanned every corner of the small space. There was nowhere for anyone to go. The door was still shut. The window was closed. It didn't make sense. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and let out a shaky laugh. "Must have been a dream," I muttered, trying to convince myself. Sleep deprivation could do weird things to the brain. Maybe I had been caught in that strange state between dreaming and waking. Shaking my head, I turned the light back off and got back into bed, but sleep didn't come easy. The image of that dark silhouette lingered in my mind. I didn't think about that night again for months. It became one of those odd, unexplained moments that gets tucked away in the back of your mind, rationalized into nothingness. That changed when I visited Uncle Rick again for a family dinner. The meal was lively, filled with laughter and conversation. Rick's wife, Deb, brought out a fresh batch of rolls and set them on the table. As we ate, she casually mentioned something that made my stomach drop. "I really need to take Uncle Benny's ashes up to the ridge soon," she said. "It's been long enough. He's been sitting in the garage for months." I froze mid-bite. "Who's Uncle Benny?" Rick looked up from his plate. "Deb's great-uncle. He passed away last year. We've been meaning to spread his ashes up in the hills, but we just haven't gotten around to it." I swallowed hard. "His ashes are in the garage?" "Yeah," Deb said, nodding. "Right next to where you slept last time you were here." The fork in my hand suddenly felt heavier. My mind raced back to that night, the shadowed figure standing silently in my room, watching me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I gripped my glass of water, suddenly aware of how dry my throat had become. I forced a chuckle, trying to mask the unease creeping over me. Well, maybe he was wondering who the hell I was, sleeping next to his resting place. Rick and Deb laughed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Uncle Benny had, in fact, been watching me that night. And maybe, just maybe, he wasn't pleased.